Hello friends. For today's video, I wanted to do a part 2 to a list of books that I think would make fantastic movies. And I said in the last video, but I'll repeat here in case you didn't see that one, that I specifically wanted to find books that I think would make good movies, because most of the time I find that books are better suited if they're going to be adapted. They'd be best as shows, or, because I love video games, as video games. But I just find that almost always movies do not have the time to really do the stories justice. But occasionally you come across a book that the amount of time it took to tell the story, what the story is, what it's saying, and even the imagery that it creates actually would work, I think, really well in movie form. So I'm gonna go ahead and kick it off with a book that I read somewhat recently, and this book was weird, and I don't know exactly how it would work. With part 1, I did go into detail about if I thought it should be animated, live action, the style, comparing it to other movies that already exist. And this one, they're just sci-fi, that's what I'll say. There's been a lot of fantastic sci-fi movies and shows that have come about that I think you could just kind of imagine any of them, any of your favorites. So I feel a little bad that I'm not being super specific with this one, but the book itself would be Clean Air. So this one, part of why I think it would make a great movie is because it, at its core, is a murder mystery. However, what would give it a little bit of an edge, and I think would make it not just a good movie, but would make it stand out, because I feel like so many movies nowadays, they don't feel all that original. It feels like we're just remaking the same things over and over again. It feels like everything's a Marvel movie. So what would make this a little bit extra unique is the fact that it is an apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic story to some degree, because there has been something that has occurred in nature that has made it so that the air quality is essentially not something people can live within. And so now what's left of mankind, they live within these domes, and they're constantly trying to emulate what life used to be like. And some of the world building details within the story I think are really interesting, and examining what the world would look like if the remaining population was forced into these circumstances. And you're also exploring the trauma of that. The main character is a mother who remembers what it was like to live before all of this happened. However, her young daughter has only ever known this environment. And then, like I said, it's also a murder mystery, because there's a person going around murdering people by slashing their homes and exposing them to air that they can't breathe through, and that the pollen gets all over them, it gets into their nose and their throat, and then they die. So I think that the way in which the serial killer goes about killing people, the commentary that you could do with this story, I think it could be done really well. There's some parts of the book that I'm like, maybe leave those parts out of the movie. It's one of the few books that I'm like, there's some cuts you could make that could help it in adaptation form, because of course you have to cut some things when you adapt. And this one, part of why I wanted to include it beyond just I think it would make a good movie, is that I think it'd be not too difficult to figure out which parts to cut. So anyway, Clean Air, that's the first one for the list. Next up we have The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi, and I have one of you to thank, because one of you said that when you read this, it just made you think of Indiana Jones. And I completely agree. It just has such an adventurous feeling to it. It's somewhat historical fiction, but tying in interesting mythology and various different kinds of creatures and beings, and specifically kinds that I don't see very often, not just in books, but in movies, in video games, in shows. And I think that that would provide that unique edge, like what I was describing with Clean Air. And Amina al-Sarafi is such a fun character. She's also a mother, she's a little bit older, so she's constantly like, oh, I'm too old for this, my knee. And I just think that there's elements to her age playing a role in the story that I think a lot of audiences would really, really like. I think a lot of people are enjoying movies that are coming out that are like, we used to be awesome, and now we're not as awesome, but we got one last job. You know, those kinds of movies. I think a lot of people really enjoy those, and I could be wrong, but I don't find you see that type of main character as often being a woman. I feel like a lot of times you see it being a man or a group of men, and it could be really fun to see a similar style of video with a lady in the lead. And she's just such a cool awesome character. So I think that would be a ton of fun. After that, we have, this isn't even a book that I absolutely loved, but I could see a fantastic animation style just making this so whimsical and charming, and that would be The House in the Cerulean Sea. The kind of more abstract Pixar type of animation where sometimes they have really skinny necks and arms and their heads are really big and obviously their eyes are enormous. I could just see that working really well for House in the Cerulean Sea. If you don't know, the story follows a rather apathetic social worker who he is tasked with going to this one orphanage and making sure everything is being dealt with accordingly, that everybody is following all the rules. And he goes there, and the person who runs the house is this lovely, rather eccentric and happy and joyful man, and he is taking care of children that most of society has deemed unwanted children, unwanted members of society. And he, this man that runs this house, is showing all of these children so much love. These children, though, are not just randomly unwanted. The reason they're unwanted is because they are not necessarily regular people. One of them is basically this little blob that really wants to be a bellhop. And then another one is a garden gnome, and it's a girl garden gnome, and they're usually, everybody thinks they're boys, and they're all very whimsical and silly and adorable. And I think that this movie has, or this book I should say, if it were in movie form, it would just have such a nice message. It could be such a cute little fun family movie to go see, and I think all the wholesome cotton candy vibes would be really delightful. It would be a nice pick-me-up for a lot of people, and I think it's the kind of story that, because of the animation style that I'm thinking of, typically being associated with kids' movies, I could see it being a movie that people would think like, oh, my kids want to see this as a kids' movie, I'll go take my kids. But then finding themselves getting kind of teary-eyed and being like, oh my gosh, this is so cute. And I just think adults could end up finding themselves really, really liking that one. After that, we have Razor Blade Tears. So I don't know how else to describe this, but there are some movies that exist that they just feel like dad movies. You know how people are talking about like dad jokes? There's some movies that feel like dad movies, and I say this as somebody whose dad typically would enjoy dad movies. So for example, like The Expendables or anything like that. Of course other people can enjoy these as well, but there's just something that feels like, Taken is another one. It just feels like something that dads are gonna go want to see. And Razor Blade Tears, I don't know, it almost makes me think of if you took a Denzel Washington movie and you had it in book form, that's Razor Blade Tears. So now just do the opposite. Take that book and cast Denzel Washington and a few other great actors, and you've got yourself an adaptation. So the setup for this is that it's actually quite sad. These two men who have quite the history when it comes to criminal activity, their sons were both killed. Their sons were gay, they were in a relationship with each other, and now that they have died, it would seem that it was a hateful act that led to their deaths, and these two men, knowing they're never going to get their sons back, now want to band together to basically get some justice for their sons. And then you just kind of follow them as they break a lot of laws and make attempts to get that justice. Like I said, I could just see Denzel Washington playing one of the characters perfectly. I think he would be fantastic in this. And in general, I just think it already feels like a movie. It felt like I was watching a movie when I read this book. Last, we have The Downstairs Girl. I think both for the part 1 that I did for this, as well as the ones I've listed in today's video, this one stands out the most as far as being separate. It doesn't really feel like any of the other ones I've talked about. So I adored this book. I thought it was wonderful. It's a historical fiction that follows a young Asian woman who is living in America at a time when women are trying to gain more rights. However, because racism is still very prevalent, there is a lot of conversations about women wanting more rights, and when women of color try to lend their voices to the cause, a lot of times white women don't want them lending their voices because they think it discredits what they have to say and the rights that they are trying to gain. And we find that our main character, being a young Asian woman, she sees a lot of the discrimination that is occurring, and through some very cheeky, silly, fun things occurring, she is able to write a column in their paper. Nobody knows it's her. She's writing it anonymously, and she is so funny, and she's just filled with wisdom, and she is delightful. And so I already think that she's so humorous, and despite the more serious subject matter, the story has a lightness to it. And on top of that, there's a really sweet romantic relationship that blossoms in the story through all of this. And it is really so heartwarming and adorable. And I just think that we have seen recently a lot more historical fiction becoming really extremely popular. And I think the costume designs and all of those things, like, I haven't watched Bridgerton, but just the costumes and the where they film and things like that, I can see a lot of people, if you had a similar team doing the costumes and you found a fantastic location to film on and whatnot, I think a lot of people would really like it immediately just for that. But on top of that, the main character makes hats. And so I can just imagine all of the fabulous hats and some really amazing person making and designing all of these hats for the show. It would be one of those things where I could see them winning an Oscar and everything just for the design. So I think it would be kind of a feast for the eyes for people that appreciate those sorts of things. I think it would be really fun. But anyway, that's it for some additional books that I think would make fantastic movies. If you're interested in seeing part 1, because it was a lot of different types of books in part 1, if you're interested in seeing that, I'll have it linked, and I would love to know what are some books that you think would make fantastic movies, and if they were to become movies, who would direct it, what would be the style you would want, do you want live action, do you want animated, let me know. But anyway, thanks so much for watching, I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.